Yeah. Hello, this is Robert Rickover. I'm an Alexander Technique teacher in Omaha, Nebraska. And my guest today is Amanda Cole, an Australian academic researcher, writer, and performer. And she is the author of this book that I'm now holding up for you to see, called Marjorie Barstow and the Alexander Technique, Critical Thinking in Performing Arts Pedagogy. She's won numerous awards for creative projects, research projects, professional development, and she has a doctorate in performing arts pedagogy from Griffith University and a master's of music performance from the University of Melbourne. And she's also a long time student of both the classic version and you could say the Barstow-inspired version of the technique. She draws on multiple sources, including a significant collection of written correspondence between F.M. Alexander, Marjorie Barstow, and Frank Pierce-Jones, and Professor John Dewey, that provides a new and very different perspective on the history of the Alexander technique. So, Amanda, welcome.
Thank you.
We've had several conversations before, and today we're going to put the question to you, and I may chime in occasionally. Here's the question. How do John Dewey's idea about teaching fit in with Marjorie Barstow's group teaching? And I should probably mention that Dewey was an educator and a philosopher. And he in the education area, he had some very interesting ideas about teaching. And he also was he's considered the father of American public school education. He's also America's most famous philosopher. His field was pragmatism. So anyway, how did Dewey's ideas fit in with Marge's ideas, group teaching?
Okay, and we only have half an hour, but that's basically the subject of my book. In fact, I wanted the title to be Marjorie Barstow, John Dewey, and the Alexander Technique, but Palgrave said that was too long. So I unfortunately had to get rid of John Dewey, but in the whole bulk of the book, which is part 2, is actually Dewey's principles in Bastow's teaching. So just to give you the overview, I divided that chunk, that part into 4 main pieces and called them, I named them after aspects of ideas in Dewey's philosophy. So one was making ideas clear, one was reconstruction, and I'll go into what these mean. One is desire and application and art, and one is democracy in the social context. So those are kind of pillars. They're not the only pillars by any means, but they are really important pillars of Dewey's thinking and philosophy. And when I was doing my research and reading about Marge and starting off, the way I started my research, apart from actually having lessons with a Barstow teacher, with Kathy Madden, and getting fascinated in how her teaching was different from other Alexander teachers, the main thing that I did was to read the book of essays, the Festschrift that Barbara Conable edited. And I did was I read through everyone's essay and I collected ideas that kept on recurring.
This was something that was created for her 90th birthday, and it had short accounts about people's experience with her work. I think there were about 15 or 20 possibly people.
Maybe even more.
Something like that. And people just discussed what it was like to study with Marge, and in some cases how it differed from how they had studied Alexander before. Yeah. So
I use these essays to collect recurrent ideas.
right.
So things that kept on coming up in more than one essay, and that's how I ended up choosing the sections of what I wanted to use to analyze Marge's teaching. And at the same time, I was reading Dewey, which I got the idea from. I mean, obviously, everyone knows the quotes about Dewey from in the beginning of the use of the self and the CCC, but and the fact that Dewey was a great salesman for Alexander,
He was.
But pragmatism. So this idea I got from Terry Fitzgerald's PhD, where he wrote about teacher training. So I'm very grateful to him as well. But these ideas, making ideas clear, is something that Dewey wanted to do in philosophy because he was impatient with philosophy that didn't define its terms and didn't really unpack what it was talking about, and it was not transparent, and it was difficult to understand. So that was one of his one of the key things that he did for philosophy was to make it about the problems of men, he called it, but meaning the problems of people in their everyday lives, and that's what he wanted to make philosophy about, rather than the ivory tower idea of philosophy. Mm-hmm. So I then connected Marge's teaching with that, and we can talk about that as well. The Reconstruction chapter is because one of the things that Dewey wrote was a book called The Reconstruction of Philosophy. And that's where, again, it's connected again to making ideas clear, but he reconstructed it so that it was practical and, again, understandable and relevant to people. Mm-hmm. Then desire, application, and art. So Dewey just, again, is the application thing of applying philosophy to everyday problems. And in that section as well, I mentioned his book, Art as Experience, which Marge did read. Mm-hmm. And I mean, she read several of his works, but that was the one that I got very excited when I found the letter, because I suspected that she had read Dewey, and I spoke to several people about what was in Marge's library. And they said she had a very big library, but I couldn't tell you whether Dewey was in that library. So it was a kind of eureka moment where when I found the letter that she wrote to Frank saying, "Oh yes, I read Art as Experience when it came out," and I think that was when she was in Boston, working with A.R. Alexander, and she said, "And I read Art as Experience, and I agreed with many things in it." That's my partner, and we're on an international interview at the moment. Hi, Tim. Okay. Robert, could we pause for a second, because I have to have a quick meeting downstairs with somebody. Sorry. Okay, and then, so as to after the desire chapter, so as I was saying about being the eureka moment of finding that Marge had read Art as Experience and agreed with many things in it. That was right. A very exciting moment in my research. Yep. And then the next section is democracy and the social context, where those are two big ideas of Dewey's, and the link that I made with Marge's teaching is about communication. So that was one of her, communication and group teaching. Mm-hmm. And that's where those two things aligned. So do you want to, like, there's a lot in there. Do you want to just choose one to talk about?
I mean, Marge was kind of a pioneer in the Alexander world for doing a large group teaching and even small. I mean, there weren't too many people teaching in groups back in the 70s, I don't think. And and those who was usually very small groups, say in a holiday course setting or something like that. Whereas Marge, the first workshop I went to her was a small one, 25 people, which seemed a lot to me, but so I could see in the things that you're mentioning from Dewey, like the making it using language that's accessible to people. I think Marge was almost kind of a natural at that, but I think maybe she did pick up something from reading his book. She certainly did not go into jargon, particularly in the Alexander technique. She kept it very practical and down to earth. You might say very Nebraskan.
Well, that was what I was going to say. That while you were saying that, there's a quote of hers. I can't remember where it's from, where she says, "I'm just a farmer digging in the dirt," and of course, she wasn't just a farmer by any means.
Just a farmer
but what that encapsulates for me is her practicality and wanting to make things accessible and direct.
Very much so, yeah. And I think one of the things that Dewey's that you mentioned was that people, if I'm hearing it right, that people had to really be interested in learning this for this to be a worthwhile project, and perhaps even more in group work than one-on-one. I don't know, but you had to have people that actually were interested. And I think that's reason for being interested.
Yeah, which is true for all education.
Yeah, but maybe even more true for the Alexander technique because it's such an unusual thing for most people. It's kind of,
I don't know. I just had this same conversation with teachers at the new school that I'm working in, and I have encountered it in music. I have had students who sign up for piano lessons, and when I talk to their parents about the fact that they don't seem very interested, their parents say, "Oh no, he has to do piano," and this is what the child has absolutely no interest.
Right.
We have the same thing with I think what the difference is between the Alexander technique and stuff at school is that sometimes at school you have to do a particular subject because it's part of the course you've signed up for, or you have to do it because that's what the school says you have to do, or your parents say you have to do piano. But with the Alexander technique, most of the time no one's forcing you to do it.
No, certainly not.
And so you're fortunate in a way when you're teaching the Alexander technique, because most people are actually there because they want to be, but there are varying degrees of that. And I think that Marge tended to allow kind of self-selection of people if they weren't motivated enough to speak up in a group and say, I want to turn, then she figured that their desire wasn't great enough. And so that then self-selected. So people who didn't want to be challenged then didn't like her teaching necessarily.
Right. Although she made it clear to people that if they just wanted to watch, that was okay. And for some people, I think they needed a little time watching other people before they were brave enough to get up in front of a group. And if they were, say, a singer singing, or, so, but yes, there would be some people would come and they wouldn't come again, and that was fine. But over time, more and more people started coming, and the groups got bigger and bigger until in the mid 80s, we're getting like sizes of 75, 100 people at one time in a room with Marge. And
So that's a big challenge to speak up in a group that size to say, I really want to
It
do
is,
this.
but people did.
Yeah.
And I actually always was curious how she was going to handle this, because as the numbers kept growing, I thought there's going to come a point when it's just not going to be possible. And her solution to that problem was to kind of speed things up. Oh, hi, I think you're frozen. Oh, you're not frozen. You were still. She would speed things up, and she would go faster in getting ideas across. And maybe there were some people who couldn't quite keep up, but she was able to do a lot more in a short period of time than she had earlier. That was something I noticed with her teaching.
Yeah, and I was just going back to the desire thing. I think there are different levels. I mean, like there are different levels of learning things. You know, do you ever have the experience where you learn something and you've already, you go, oh, I've just understood this. And then you think, hang on, I've actually learned this 20 times, but I've only just understood it on a new level or a new kind of perspective or way, or I don't know. And I suppose there would be people of all those different levels in a class that size, with the varying degrees of desire,
right,
and varying degrees of resistance. Because Patrick McDonald tells that story about a student. No, it wasn't Patrick McDonald. Sorry, it was Walter Carrington, who told the story of a student who said, "Oh yeah, I guess I really don't want to do this," and that was a clarifying moment. But see, I used that in the book to talk about the fact that Walter Carrington was talking about getting up, sitting down and standing up, using a chair, doing chair work. And I used to have the same experience when I did chair work. I had absolutely no interest in how I sat down or stood up from a chair, sat down in a chair or stood up from a chair. It was totally boring to me. And so every time I would do it, I would kind of freeze, because there was this sort of mysterious way of doing it right that I had this idea of, and the idea wasn't clear, and ultimately I didn't really care whether I was right or wrong. And when I got it right, my teacher told me I'd got it right, I had no idea what I'd done differently from when I'd done it wrong, and I didn't want to take it home and practice it. So I suppose the desire thing, the reason I wrote that big chapter about desire was that by introducing the idea that the student bring the activity that they care about to class was really important, because that's where my learning about the Alexander changed, where I stopped doing chair work. And unless I wanted I was wondering and particularly interested in a particular chair on a particular day, then Kathy would work with me on that. But otherwise, it was what I was wanting to change my use in. So what activity I wanted to bring the awareness of my use to.
Well, I would say
really fascinated.
Your early experience with something like chair work, it sounds like the teacher didn't explain that this was just an example of an activity, that it wasn't, the Alexander technique is not about learning how to stand up and sit down properly.
No, I wouldn't blame my teachers so much. It was more, because I did also do singing. It was just, look, it's so long ago now too. I don't want to talk so much about that. It's just that more about me. I don't want to talk about what the teacher said or didn't say, because my memory's hazy. Right. And I enjoyed my lessons, and I did learn stuff. It's just that when we came to do chair work, what I remember distinctly is the feeling of, why am I doing this? And I don't really care whether I do this particular way or that particular way, and I can't feel the difference, and I can't sense any difference in whether it's good or bad. And ultimately, I don't care.
Right. Well, that's not a good formula for learning new ideas, really, is it?
No, but it wasn't. Look, I didn't do a lot of chair work. So also, to be fair to my teacher, we didn't do a lot of chair work. We did do more singing and and some activities. It's just that when we did do the chair work, I was kind of nonplussed. Like, I just couldn't work out why we were doing this, and it didn't interest me at all. And then when we did do the singing stuff, then I was vitally interested in the quality of my use and how it affected my singing. And so I was totally switched on to what was different about that, and why was that different. So that's the desire piece.
Right. And, you know, when I was in London in that period, late 70s, early 80s, the standard idea was you would just teach these sort of procedures like chair work, table work, whatever. And that if your student was a singer or a musician or performer of some kind, it would somehow by osmosis carry over to those activities. And I'm sure to a certain extent it did in many cases, but a lot of cases, no. There were particular stressors for, say, a violinist, you know, tighten up even just opening the case, there'd be issues. And it wasn't enough just to do those procedures. And Marge just bypassed that basically by saying, well, what do you want to do? You know, let's talk about the democracy. Dewey was big on democracy, right? You could say. Or
he was. And just before we go, there was something I wanted to say about playing the violin, for example. And you were talking about different stressors. But the thing that one of the real benefits, and I think Marge teachers aren't alone in realizing this now. It's becoming much more popular. But by teaching in a group, you're actually helping you're providing a real life situation for a performer, because the rest of the group can act as the audience. And so that then it doesn't seem such a big step to go from a lesson to a performance or a rehearsal, because you've already practiced it with other people in the room who have opinions and
can give feedback. And can give feedback that maybe Marge couldn't give. I mean, other singers in the room might notice something very similar. Marge was not a singer, and she might not notice it, so they could give really useful feedback. So on the democracy, it was a very democratic little world that you entered when you started going to Marge's workshops, in the sense that there were people there who were like regular customers. You know, they'd been going for years, and many of them were teachers, been teaching for many years. And at the same time, there would always be some people, this is the first time they ever heard of the Alexander technique. You know, they might have just wandered in. If it was in a dormitory situation in the summer, there would be people there at summer school that talked to people there, and they would just come in and be part of the group. And often the only way someone on the outside could tell who were the more experienced people and who were not was that some of the more experienced people, when Marge said, who wants to do something, the only thing they could think of was maybe teaching somebody else as an activity. And they didn't really have a lot of activities to draw on. Marge would make it easier sometimes by saying, well, let's all work with walking. Everyone does that, you know, that was fine. But there was a curious reticence of some of the more, you know, longer, we'll say the teachers or teacher trainees, they were a little bit at a loss to come up with something to do sometimes.
So they made the Alexander technique into a what?
Well,
rather than
and they would say, well, maybe I could teach somebody and you could help me teach them, which was a very tricky thing to say or do, because if she agreed to that, then you were going to be subject to really intense teaching. She wasn't going to let you get away with anything, not even how you walked over to the student to start. She said, well, what are you thinking about right now? You know, what's going on in your mind? She was very, very tough on people who wanted to do that. I personally stayed away from that. It was too scary for me.
Really?
Yeah, I did not want to. I wasn't ready for that. So I had strategies for getting work, but they did not involve teaching other people.
Right.
Or,
interesting. And the teaching thing, I mean, the multi-level teaching thing is also what still surprises a lot of Alexander teachers today, I think, even though, because a lot of Marge's ideas are not so new and not so radical in the Alexander world anymore. But one that I think is still quite radical is the multi-level teaching and the removal of the boundary between a beginner class and a teaching training class. Because what in the very beginning of our interview, you said something like that no one was teaching in groups in the 70s, and I was going to say, well, except for training courses.
A little bit.
The training courses taught in groups.
Well, that is true. Training courses were all pretty much groups.
Yeah.
But the explanation for that was, well, that's a different situation. That's people who are going to be teachers. So we don't count that as group teaching.
Yeah. And so what Marge did,
total nonsense as far as I can see. I mean, it makes no sense at all. But that was the rationale for that being okay, but not other. And it was a very, in the late 70s and early 80s, a very contentious thing in London. There were some of the senior teachers who were just dead set against it, and there were others who were thinking, "Oh, it's just fine." And it got very personal and nasty, to put it mildly. Actually, could be very nasty.
So I have a question for you. The democracy thing, one of the aspects of democracy that I wrote about was the fact that Marge actually invited conversation and actually was interested in the expertise of her students, which was also fairly radical at that time, and actually still is in my experience as a professional educator, and you could also call me a professional student. I've basically been a student all my life, as well as a teacher and a performer. But I think that teachers traditionally have quite a hard time in acknowledging that their students might know things that they don't know.
Yeah.
And so my understanding of Marge was that she wasn't like that, and she was very open to all the stuff that other people could bring into the discussion in a lesson.
She tended to be very interested in the things their students were interested. She wanted to know more about it. She would ask questions. She would, she was genuinely curious about things like that. The other thing is that when the classes were over and there was people were going to dinner or going to this and that, she wanted to be part of that too. If there was going to be a group going for dinner, she wanted to be there, or going to see a play or whatever. She was enjoyed those kind of activities and wanted to be part of it.
Which is another reason I called that chapter Democracy and the Social Contract. So she, just to be clear as well, it wasn't that she handed over the authority for the class to the students. No. Like, she was in charge. I got that very clearly from what I've heard and read and what people have told me. She was in charge, but she was open and curious about what other people could offer. And then there was this really nice story Sarah Barker told me about when she would stay in Nebraska and go and Marge would take different students around with her on her just chores and things that she did with around the town.
Mhm.
and to give Marge the social context, to give to the real social context. So there's a social context in the class that Marge created,
Mhm.
which was different from a one-on-one lesson.
Mhm. Mhm.
And then there was also the wider social context where she would take students out and go out with them, as you said, go out to plays with them. And she would be watching people all the time, her students, herself, everyone, and was just fascinated in how people moved and didn't move. And
He was always observing people. And but I would say not in a judgmental way.
No.
She was curious about how people did things and moved.
And kind. I mean, the way that that Sarah Barker described it was that she would go around with Marge. Sarah would go around with Marge, and then after a little while, she would say, or a few days, I don't know what the time period was, but she would say, I've been watching you as you go about your business, and I'm wondering if you could think a little bit more about this. So not this, you're so terrible.
Yeah.
Not that kind of judgmental or criticism, but
not judgmental.
Kind. What's Kathy's two things that she talks? Kindness and honesty. Is something that Marge always strived to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Do we miss it? Do we?
What's the past participle to strive? I strove.
What's that?
Right? What's the past tense of strive? I strove.
Strove.
I have striven. Yeah, anyway, I just said strived, and I thought that's such a I never used that word in the past. Anyway,
so anything else about Dewey and Marge's group teaching that you can think of?
Hundreds of things. It's more a question of limiting it to one particular question. So we talked about the application approach, and desire. I won't open up the inhibition because that's another whole hour of conversation, I think. But it was connected. So the importance of desire for learning, I also connected to the problem with inhibition as stopping. And the fact that, and to go back to one of the earlier sections, which is making ideas clear and reconstructing. So Marge reconstructed a lot of Alexander's language without, in my opinion, and without actually changing the principle. So by changing the language, she was attempting to make things clearer, not to actually change the Alexander technique. And a lot of people got very upset about that and said that that's no longer the Alexander technique because she's not using these words. In effect, they were saying she's not doing this, but really what she was doing was not using the words that Alexander, or the form, the teaching forms, the positions of mechanical advantage, she wasn't using those. And so that's what people had started to recognize as the Alexander technique, where she said, no, it's actually principles, it's not words, and it's not forms.
Yeah, absolutely, totally.
And that's where that kind of dovetails with the desire.
And getting hung up on that critique that she wasn't using the standard procedures, they missed, I think, the really important things about her teaching.
Yeah,
were myriad and were put it in a category of its own, really. I had never experienced, I was halfway through a training course when I first met Marge, and I'd had quite a bit of exposure even outside the training course with traditional teaching, and I had never encountered anything like what Marge was doing. And her way of thinking about the technique and how to teach it was completely new to me. And it took me several days to wrap my mind around it. But very quickly, I realized that she was on to something extremely important. And the procedures thing, it's just not that important, I don't think. That personal view of mine, but
for me neither. But
well, maybe.
And I had a similar revelation when I went to Kathy Madden's first Australian workshop.
Mhm.
And I had always, it had always been really a puzzle and a mystery exactly what was required between head and spine.
Yeah.
And I remember coming away from that workshop. Oh yeah, I remember a couple of things specifically that Kathy said to me that were like light bulb moments. One was where I went up to her after she'd finished a class, and I was asking her about something, and she said, "Well, it is movement that we want." And I was like, "Oh, okay." It's this simple thing that she said, "It is movement that we want." And I went, "Oh, yeah, I've been trying to do this thing without moving." Like,
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And there was,
that's a distinction that is still not always adhere. I mean, I think some teachers do almost think in terms of position, I mean, they would say they aren't, but it does seem like it kind of.
Well, trying to get there without moving is what I think I was trying to do. And so when he said it is movement, I just went, oh,
yeah,
of course it's movement. Like, how do you make a change without moving?
Yeah.
And that's just something I hadn't understood, and not to blame my other teachers, but just the clarity that Marge brought and that Kathy brings as well. Mm-hmm. Kathy brings her own clarity as well, but
right.
In this book I tried to focus on the innovations of Marge, and sometimes it's quite difficult for me because Kathy's been my main teacher for nearly 20 years. A lot of the stuff that I've learned from her is direct from Marge, and a lot of it is her own innovation and creativity. So that was also a big job for me to actually try to separate. This is the Marge.
Right.
And it's not so important really ultimately. But when I'm writing a book about Marge, I had to check quite a few things with Kathy. I said, was this you or was this Kathy? Right. So was this you or was this Marge? So Kathy did read it before I published it, just in case I had misrepresented her or Marge.
Right. So maybe you think we should end here? I know you have to.
Yeah, it's a good amount.
Deal with pressing issues.
Bite size.
So we've been talking. My guest today is Amanda Cole, and she has written this book. Sunlight is driving me. Maybe you could hold up your copy.
Oh, good idea. I have no sun. It's cloudy.
And I highly recommend this book, by the way. You can get it on Amazon. It's a little pricey, but honestly, I think it's worth it.
Pricey.
So
not much.
So thank you so much, Amanda. And
thank you, Robert, again.
Take care, and we'll have one more interview maybe next week. Let's see. Anyway,